manhood is often connected to this idea of like rugged individualism and I'm doing this by myself and quietly doing it by myself. But like the there were many social forces and social safety nets that made it possible for a lot of these boomer men to get where they're at.
In a world that often pulls us apart, More in Common brings us back to what matters. Hosted by Gerren Taylor and Keith Richardson, this isn't your average podcast. It's a challenge to think deeper, question louder, and grow further. At More in Common, we work with NFL teams, tech companies, and professionals across industries to improve communication and foster compassion. And with a focus on emotional intelligence, we aim to bring a wealth of experience to help you navigate the complexities of human connection. We've never been more connected and yet more isolated. We want to explore the roots of that tension and offer a way back to what we all need: real human connection. Enjoy the show.
Dang,
Yeah, no,
You
and
are
so I just
loud.
whatever you can say on the internet is
Yeah,
what
it's
we
like-
allow here.
Fuck shit. Don't
Oh,
celebrate
boy.
it, Frank.
Whoa,
You
whoa,
know? Don't celebrate it, Frank.
Let's start just jumping right in. Huh?
Hey, it's cold open. It's our cold open.
Welcome to the More in Common podcast. I'm Gerren Taylor.
In
And
case you
that
didn't
potty
know.
mouth is Keith Richardson over there, just being a sailor. We've got a guest with us this week. Nicholas Miller, a tenured sociology professor, facilitator, and systems change strategist with over 2 decades of experience advancing equity, inclusion, and leadership across education, health, and justice systems. Since 2004, he's a full-time faculty member at Sacramento City College, where he founded the social work and community studies and community health worker programs, creating workforce pipelines that connect diverse students to careers in community development, social work, and public health. Nicholas also co-founded SCC's nationally recognized Reemerging Scholars Program, supporting formerly incarcerated and justice impacted students, which, we love that here, and helped launch the Rising Scholars Network, serving nearly 60 colleges statewide. He's also the founder. You're a busy guy, Nicholas. He's the founder of Conduits for Change, partnering with organizations to build equity-driven cultures and lasting community impact. Welcome to the show, Mike, sir.
Thank you. Sounds so formal, and I need you to announce me every time I go into a
Listen,
a
I am
space.
for
love it.
hire.
Yeah. I would be happy to follow you around and announce you into every room you walk into, in the grocery store.
And give it
Yeah.
give it up, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah.
It helps the applause lines, you know what I mean?
That's great. That's great.
Well,
Hope that you add applause
we-
in there.
That's right. Like, he's going to have a speaker that follows him around and a hat that has like
Don't get me
audience
started. Listen, we're in a
applause
new
light on
season. If
top
you
of it.
want me to bring a soundboard and start throwing sound effects into the show, I'll play that role.
Wah, wah.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, we're excited. This is the start of a new year, 2026 for us. Last year, we spent a lot of time really talking about emotional awareness and how we navigate conversations, things that get in the way, logical fallacies, how to suss them out, and how to understand them and work through them in order to develop better connection. And to kick off this year, the reason we wanted to have you on is, as a sociologist, you've dabbled quite a bit in the social structures of masculinity. And we're going to kick 2026 off diving deep into this topic, specifically around the idea of how these social identities on gender and sex and how we show up impact our ability to connect with people both positively and negatively. And with that said, would love to really establish a baseline though, with everything that's going on today around this topic, from the manosphere and podcasting to Scott Galloway in his new book to redefine masculinity, and our military, the Department of War, and that representation of masculinity. you kind of seeing the confusing nature of how this shows up. So from a sociologist perspective, from your point of view, how do we level set on what this thing is that we're trying to navigate? And then we'll go from there.
Well, I mean, that's a huge, huge question. I think, I mean, over the
Enjoy
conversation, we can
time.
try to unpack all of those things. But I think, I mean, over the last like 40, 50 years, really, we've been trying to unpack this question to some degree. And I do think like to get at level setting, like in terms of thinking about how does masculinity appear today? I think we have to recognize like there's been a study of masculinities over the last like 30 years. Like I know there's a lot of conversation going on right now about masculinity and manhood, especially in the wake of Galloway's recent book, and people seem to be talking about it. But going back to the 70s, 80s, into the 90s, like there's been different men's movements that have appeared and really kind of playing with like what does manhood mean, and if you're embracing your manhood, is it, is this a good thing? Is this a safe thing? Are you contributing to what is now called kind of toxic masculinity? Or are you contributing to maybe more of like a feminist version of masculinity that's kind of a reaction to patriarchy? And so I feel like in terms of like trying to like level set and get at like where are we at with manhood, I think we do have to acknowledge that like masculinity is not necessarily like an inherent idea in males. Like there is no like universal essential biological masculinity that makes just men stoic and strong and aggressive and competitive and violent, but rather like there are many masculinities that sex.
And that's the interesting starting place about Keith's question too, is because in some ways all of those archetypes do exist and have their own validity, but the moving target of that too, right? So I feel like we started to see a lot of this conversation in retrospect when shows like Mad Men were coming out that started to look back at old archetypes of masculinity versus the man of today, which is considered softer in a lot of ways. But then the examination of both sides of that coin starts to happen too, right? Like you might have liked this type of the male role or the archetype of that male, but there are dark sides to how they treat women, how they treat their families to maintain sort of that power aspect, which is part of what I see when you're referring to like the aggressive or toxic male traits that you see in what I would consider like the bellicose nature of trying to be the Department of War or something like that, as opposed to just being a fighting force that's made up of men and women and God forbid trans soldiers too, right? Like it's not that big a deal. If that's how people are and they're willing to sacrifice, then maybe that valor is the part that we like, as opposed to just the stricter definitions.
Yeah,
But
like we like the idea of protection. And so how does protection manifest itself? Doesn't have to be violent. It doesn't have to be aggressive. It doesn't have to be competitive. But like you said, like, yeah, we value protection, but how it manifests can be so variable. And so we don't have to think about it in just one way, the way that we hear it kind of being announced by chief of Department of War saying they have to be clean shaven with,
yeah, be clean shaven
with no
and
guts.
you can't be fat. The fatties. On that note, you said something that's, I think, interesting. This idea of masculinities has been a conversation that really spurred in the 70s and 80s.
Yeah.
Relative to the way it's talked about as if it's always been a thing that we've talked about. Prior to the studies of masculinities, what was it? Just the role of men and women? Like what was this intellectual conversation, or was there one?
Well, I think most of the conversations around gender were about, like, at least in our society, was that there were gender roles that then those gender roles could inform how, how to best organize family life, how to organize community life, economic life. And in the 60s and like 50s, 60s, 70s, we started to see the rise of a feminist kind of critique of patriarchy and masculinity. And the economy and in family and in community. And so it was an exploration of like, well, the subordination of women. How do our social structures, our economic structures, our political structures, subordinate women? And how does our culture maintain patriarchy through misogyny? And so by like in the late 60s and 70s and 80s, like there was a movement to look at the kind of arose out of the feminist movement to explore like masculinity through kind of like a feminist lens, to acknowledge that patriarchy wasn't necessarily equivalent to masculinity. That, like these ideas of social roles of men and women in society, that we see as like husbands and wives and fathers and mothers were social ideas, that they are essentially social constructs. That the idea of femininity and masculinity, or man and woman, are variable across time and place, that they vary. So like we could look at masculinity in
And
another,
I think
cultural context. Go ahead.
that's kind of where the crossroads I feel like we're at in a lot of ways too, because there is this redefinition, shifting of society. Look, I mean, in the Mad Men society, that era, like just to draw that analysis again, like women didn't have access to the workplace as much. They didn't have access to credit. You know what I mean? So I think we face a different world today where now economically men and women are more on par. So thus the relationships. This is some of the things that I think that Galloway gets right in his observations about how masculinity and the definitions thereof change, is that the nature of relationships, especially between men and women, have changed due to power balances, right? There's more women in college now than men, more women being college educated. They're starting to have more economic independence compared to the generations previous to, and that changes how people interact in relationships. So I do wonder how we kind of deal with that, because we're in this internet age. The AI, it's getting stronger. I mean, there was a report the other day that Americans spent $2.5 billion with a B on OnlyFans in 2025. And that's got to be mostly men. Like, let's just be honest.
I
That's,
mean, don't you have a channel?
I mean, if I could get me a piece of
Am I
that
alone here?
$2.5 billion, I surely would think about it, right?
I might have a channel tomorrow, guys. I don't know.
But I wonder how the loneliness factor, not only has increased, but also exacerbates the big question mark of how men define themselves. And what's your take on that?
Mm.
Yeah, I mean, so if we think about the ideas of manhood and masculinity, like the traditional notions, and like this, you know, self-made, rugged individual, stoic, not needing others, but achieving through like individual effort and accomplishment, which none of those things are inherently bad or problematic, other than the assumption that that's how everybody accomplishes things, or that's how men accomplish it. Because I, you know, again, going back to history, like I think that was part of what happened in the 80s and 90s. Was there was a there were a lot of men that, especially boomer age men, that really were like, look at what I've accomplished on my own, and why am I having to pay so much taxes towards welfare and take care of all of these other people? I made it. I did this all on my own. But if we look back to the 1960s and 70s and the rise of kind of like the welfare state in the United States, there was a lot of help given to these rugged individualists and these men who made it. Many of our fathers, because I'm an Xer, near millennial, so Zennial or whatever.
Mm.
But had a boomer dad who was like, why aren't you guys making it like we did? And we just did it. And it's like, well, you grew up in a society where like there was a welfare state supporting families, and then the cost of college education was actually affordable. There were jobs like for many families in the 60 50 60 70s where like a job could support a household. But that changed in the 60s and 80s, where there was more of a need for more of two income households. But so everything was changing. But so my point, you can tell, like, I'm a professor and I can just ramble forever. My point being, going to your question,
Good.
is that manhood is often connected to this idea of like rugged individualism, and I'm doing this by myself and quietly doing it by myself. But like the there were many social forces and social safety nets that made it possible for a lot of these boomer men to get where they're at. And so in the 80s and 90s, we did see this movement of like, hey, let's cut welfare. Let's cut all of these things that were maybe protecting families and uplifting people. But part of that was like a response to men that had made it because of those things. And then they felt justified because they didn't even notice the privilege maybe that they had. And they're like, let's cut it. And so now we see younger generations of men that don't have a lot of those safety nets to provide for their families in similar ways. And so we've got different generations. So going back to my idea of like, there are different masculinities, or maybe even some of the same strands of masculinity, but different time periods of, or different demographics of like older men who embrace this idea are like, I did it. And younger men that are like, I want to do it, but they're not in the same circumstances. Like I even heard Scott Galloway talk about, even at least in his interviews, I don't know if it was in his book, like when he went to UCLA, there was like a 78% acceptance rate, where now it's like 9%.
So when I got into UCLA, the admissions rate was 70%. I had to apply twice to get in. Now, or this year, it'll be 9%.
That's a very different context, in which a political and economic context, in which to start out life as a man to then be able to do things. And so there's going to be different levels of frustration amongst different ages of men.
And the reality of coming out of the school like that nowadays, with the debt that's happened, like you were talking about, not only were things cheaper, but people were also supported more by the welfare state and the largesse of the government. And I do think
Federally.
that also creates isolation, right? Like people often make fun of incels, and with good reason often, but there is a reason why they're trapped in their mom's basement or don't feel like they can date. It's because they're not economically viable in the world to exist like that. And then it builds upon itself, right? So like when you feel like you're not participating in society in the way that you thought you were going to be or cannot, then you start to resent society for existing in a place where you cannot exist, and then you start getting angrier and angrier. Which part of, again, the reason why so many of these critiques happen is because we are admitting that there is nowadays what we would consider a male loneliness epidemic occurring.
Yeah,
there is a lot of isolation.
yeah.
And
So if I could interject, because I'm like this like burning need to ask this question, but I'm going to take us on a little bit of a journey that's not hopefully too far from the center.
what else is new?
I have so many things to
I got-
say to it. Gerren was just saying, now.
Oh, then say what you were going to say. Say what you were going to say. I'm not going to interrupt. Go say it. I can come back to my
Locking it
question.
in,
It's not
though.
going anywhere. No, say what you were going to say. I'll come back. I'll come back. We got
Well-
plenty of time.
Oh my gosh. Okay. So, well, one, like, like Gerren was saying, like dudes locked in their basements, just kind of like incelling, diving deep into whatever dark interwebs that there might be, that might be kind of locked into the manosphere or elsewhere. But like, I think that that's also a demographic thing as well, right? So we see, or it's based on context, I guess. It's not demographic, it's context. Like today, we may be more likely to be isolated because the advent of technology over the last 25 years with the internet and having access to the world in our basements, right? Where you don't even have to go outside and experience the world. So we are more likely to be locked in just because we have access to something that makes us feel like we're out there. And then with the pandemic, keeping us in and not allowing us to really go out there. And then a lot of people like embracing it, and a lot of people also being frustrated about not being able to go out and going deep into their interwebs and stuff like that. So one, I think we have to think about the technological context as well as the timing of issues that are going on. But I think like that kind of inability to participate, and then like, how am I going to respond? And maybe it's like an aggressive response, is kind of tied to historical ideas about people that were excluded from full participation in the economy anyway in our society, right? Like if we look at Black and brown masculinities in this country, when Black men and brown men were like less likely due to economic policies to be able to equally participate with their white male peers, especially the white middle class male peers. They were often in communities where it's like there was resistance. Like we can look at like the Black Power or Brown Power movements that were like, hey, these institutions aren't working for me. So how am I going to respond? I'm going to respond as like, let's create our own institutions, or let's like react in response and reject some of these institutions and revolt against them. I think what we're seeing a lot of young modern men do, though, is kind of similar, right? Like they're rejecting, but they're blaming women. They're blaming immigrants. So it's like, like we've seen this before, and we've blamed Black and brown communities in our inner cities for not fully participating because they were excluded from full participation. And now what we see is like a lot of young white men who are feeling, that are isolated, and then middle-aged and boomer men that are like lonely, and they're finding community blaming women or non-white people, especially immigrants, for the troubles that they face for the economy, when in fact, like, this was by design over the last 40 years of like deindustrializing our economy and sending our jobs overseas.
Absolutely. It's
So,
it's kind of refers back to the pulling up of the ladder that you were talking about when it comes to some of the boomers, right? Like that they got it, they're good. Everybody else, you know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
you guys don't need housing, right?
Yeah. So that was my long diatribe, Keith, that I was like, oh my gosh, like,
No,
I just feel like we
God,
have to think of it intersectional in terms of age, race, class, and gender,
yeah.
and put it all together.
I'm glad you brought that up. And it's so interesting to me. So when we think about just the last 100 years in the nature of like taking masculinity out of the conversation for a second and just thinking about the role of men, right? In a patriarchal society, going back to World War II, when was it 30% of men were sent to war or in the military in some capacity and had to be supplemented. You had women's professional baseball, as represented in A League of Their Own, the movie. You had Rosie the Riveter and all of the women that went into the manufacturing in these traditional male roles. Now, when I say traditional, I'm talking about the last 150 years. I think about the nature of male representation, wigs, dresses, high heels, these types of attire that were dominantly worn by men, or at least high heels and wigs and makeup, right? Back in the 17th,
Men look
18th
fabulous.
century, right? They looked wonderful.
But I mean, even like
you
pink as a
fast
color has changed over the 20th.
I mean, the whole element of pink being designed originally was intended as a male dominant color because they were trying to pick which color should be defining the sexes. And I think about everything that you just laid out relative to the economic role and how nowadays we're sitting here defining Scott Galloway. Okay, cool. We're trying to define the man and what they're supposed to be based on this historical context of economic superiority, right? Even though there are periods of time where there was inferiority, and we can go back even to evolutionary roles where this was far more nebulous in the defining of these positions in our society. And yet we're giving less access economically, yet fighting over this traditional idea of a man, which really is only traditional in the last 100 years. It makes me ask and think, like, what is the value of actually defining the role of a man in this society beyond what they do in the nature of child rearing in the first 2 to 5 years?
Yeah. Well, I mean, maybe it's just my like sociologist brain where it's like, we're looking at like social order And, kind of like the conservative arms of sociology were like especially like sociology in its foundation was really looking at like the rise of different kinds of problems and different social problems, and like fighting to acknowledge like these are social problems, not like deep uh, inherent like religious problems or mystical problems or inherent in biology, but acknowledging like there are social forces that are influencing trends in society was one big battle. But really early on in sociology was looking at, are there problems and how can we solve those problems? And if people are resisting inequality, like looking at like revolutions and the emergence of revolutions, like sociology was founded in the emergence of revolutions, like in Western Europe and in the United States, like if people are revolting against what the dominant social structures, what are they revolting against, and like how can we solve it even if there's inequality still built into it? It wasn't about trying to address inequality, it was about trying to retain social order. So like what can we do to retain an element of social order in society? And so much like in my mind, going to your question, is that these roles are about maintaining a sense of social order in society. And
Yeah.
so having that now, like so many conservatives, political conservatives often are like this whole idea of like saying there's non-binary, where like you don't identify as a man or a woman no matter your sex. Because again, if you were talking about level setting, I would go into like, hey, sex is socially constructed along with gender being socially constructed, because not all males are, have the same level of hormones, have the same sex attributes and those kinds of things. And so sex is a construct as well as gender. But so many people are very concerned about like, hey, when we start getting fluid and saying there's a spectrum of these roles, like that seems to be leading to disorder. And I've even had
But
like people.
that's the great folly, because it's always been like that. And if you always look at societies, they always go through that. In fact, it's what you're talking about, Keith, was given a name by a British psychologist named John Flügel in 1930, and it is called
Good
the
try.
Great
Say
Male
that again.
What? The Flügel?
Yeah, I love that.
keep going.
Sorry.
Say it again.
No,
Oh my God.
The Great Male Renunciation, right? So it's the historical phenomenon at the end of the 18th century. It's exactly what you're talking about, where men gave up wigs and they gave up looking pretty. And the idea was that men would give up these things to be seen as more rational and useful as opposed to beautiful. And that's what kind of ushered in this change in fashion and the giving up of the wigs and all that stuff. Now, whether or
There's
not that
actually
actually came to be, I mean, I guess
there-
your take on that is up to you, but
there's an
that is
I think you're both
interesting
beautiful in your
element.
hoodies. Sorry, I just wanted to say.
Thank you. And you're very handsome in your professional attire.
My professional
No,
polo.
there's an interesting element of the Revolutionary War. In the recent documentary, they talk about how they changed their attire to appear more rugged, relative to the rebel nature of their definition when the war began to break out back at that time, and what that actually has probably seeded in the minds of modern society as to what a man is supposed to be, especially in American society. I want to continue this conversation. We're going to leave a big cliffhanger here, and as we approach time on this episode, we're going to keep moving with Nick over this week, next week, and possibly the week after. But we are
Is Nick
excited to
moving
have
in?
him here. He might be a co-host here soon.
I like
He's
roommates.
really
That's
teasing
awesome.
this. It's really awesome.
I was taking over
but,
breaking this loneliness epidemic.
Yeah, we got
because
work to do.
I have a question on all of that relative to the importance of defining the manhood, these roles. Like, to your point, there's almost a slippery slope argument of not defining it, like how we're going to go into chaos. That's a whole long tail of conversation, but I want to open this next episode up on that line. So with that said, Gerren, take us out.
This is the More in Common podcast. I'm Gerren Taylor. That's Keith Richardson. Nick, thanks for joining us this week. We'll see you in like 5 seconds because we're going to do another episode.
Sounds great.